And thanks for joining us here on PM Express. Well, if nothing happens, we are going to lose a very important property in London, and that is the offices of the Ghana International Bank. And that is one that we've heard from our High Commissioner in the UK say it is embarrassing to himself, to Ghana, getting a lot of calls from Ghanaians living in the UK. They are embarrassed by what's happening. And why is that? It's because of a certain 140 million Trafigura case. And we risk now our properties in the UK being sold off to defray that particular judgment debt. Let's discuss this. This is a topic we're so familiar with in this country called judgment debt, except now that our properties in the United Kingdom and elsewhere likely going to be a subject of sale if we don't find this money to pay. So, really, what happened? It all boils down to the termination of the Trafigura case, the Trafigura deal with Ghana. And that, by the way, was something that this particular government decided to do, and they had many, many reasons for doing so, according to the Attorney General, that the 4 PPAs with a combined capacity of 181 megawatts should be deferred on to 2021. And this was if you're tracking the various decisions that have been made, the many issues that the government had themselves put forth, according to the Attorney General herself, 11 PPAs with a combined capacity of 281 megawatts among the GPGC. And GPGC was the actual company. It was a subsidiary of Trafigura that had entered into this contract to execute this project, this power project with Ghana, and was terminated as a result of that. And that the government of Ghana, Attorney General at the time, also advised that the GPGC project will result in cost of, in excess of this, $115 million if implemented with its attendant high tariff. So there's a lot of concerns that the government raised, including concerns around corruption, etc., which led to the termination, of course. And when it was terminated, we knew at the time of termination that why GPU's contract was terminated. We knew at the time if we terminated, there was going to be consequences for it. And they talked about illegality for wanton capacity. They talked about failure to obtain sitting and construction permits. They talked about installation of used plant contrary to policy. They talked about failure on the part of the GP to fulfill CP's conditions subsequent. All manner of, interventions that were put in there as reasons for the termination. But the agreement was also very clear about what would happen if we terminated it wrongly, and GPGC had obviously gone to the London court and argued that that contract was terminated wrongly, as a result of which they got the judgment in their favor. It was in excess of 160 million. We negotiated that particular deal all the way down to 140. We failed to pay, and they've gone now to say, attach the properties that we have in the UK because we failed to pay. The Finance Ministry, as we know, has been in haste in the last few days since this matter became public. As we know, it's a race against time now to raise the money to get that particular payment. So let's talk about that. My colleague, Manuel Kranting, was in London and specifically went to the premises of the Ghana International Bank there and filed this report.
This is the entrance to the Ghana International Bank here in the heart of central London in the UK. It sits within a 6-story property popularly known as Regina House, which the government of Ghana currently owns and controls. But that ownership and control may be coming to an end soon. Regina House is part of 5 other properties which the government of Ghana owns and controls in the UK, which have been attached for the purposes of being auctioned to defray $140 million judgment debt owed to Trafigura. In January 2021, Trafigura obtained a judgment debt to the tune of over $160 million against the government of Ghana for illegally terminating a contract for the installation and operation of 2 power plants in the country. In January 2021, Trafigura obtained a judgment debt to the tune of over $160 million against the government of Ghana. This was in connection with the government's illegal termination of a contract for the installation and operation of 2 power plants in the country. After over 2.5 years, negotiations and renegotiations, and a plain attempt by the government of Ghana to block the execution of that judgment debt award, it perhaps is time. Trafigura is moving to auction these properties. At least 2 of the properties on a list of 5, which include the Ghana High Commission and the Chancery, are protected by diplomatic immunity. But Regina House isn't, and may well be on its way to a new owner, Trafigura. From Central London, my name is Frantic, reporting for Joy News.
Yeah, my colleague Manuel Cranton joins us live now from London. And Manuel, we've seen the video of the building, but give us a sense of the neighborhood in which this property is located.
Also, Evans, this particular building can be found in Greater London. And just to give you a sense of the sort of buildings around, in just a radius of about 100 meters, you have the Crown Court in Greater London. You have several other banks. I can mention, for instance, in that Regina House building alone, apart from the Ghana International Bank, you have another bank called Chiba Bank. Just across the street, also, you have Lloyds Bank, one of the very popular banks here in the UK. You also have Santander, which is just on the ground floor of the Regina House building. In my estimation, of course, as I moved across the area, you get the sense that all of these buildings and properties within the area are high-value properties, none of which is below 5 stories. So these are really high-rise buildings within the Greater London area. And so it just gives you a sense of the kinds of buildings that are in the area, Evans.
Okay, and then that clearly gives us a sense there of the key properties in that particular area. But by the way, that's the building there. We know that the Ghana International Bank currently operates from inside that building, the building we're seeing there. Which other organizations are currently occupying the building, and are they aware of this development?
Well, Evans, at the time of business hours when I visited the place, business was going on pretty normally, and the employees in the building were working as they would on any other day. Sources close to the hierarchy of the, for instance, the Ghana International Bank, sources close to its managers tell me that they have taken a public notice of the ongoing conversation and have currently, what I have learned is that they have begun conversations with their lawyers to assess and consider the various options available to them for when, worst case scenario happens. Talking about the other operations, like other institutions that are occupying this Regina House building, there is another bank, another investment bank called Chiba Bank. And even with the Ghana International Bank alone, there is the normal banking wing of the company, and there's also the investment banking wing of the company. And both of them are operating in this building. They share, per my checks, the first, third, and sixth floors of this 6-story Regina House in Greater London. So this is a critical, a critical installation. And just to give you a sense of how critical this installation is, the Ghana International Bank itself has, as part of its shareholders, major financial institutions in Ghana. For instance, the Ghana Commercial Bank is one of its major shareholders, SNIT, ADB, SIC, and the likes. So these are, for instance, the shareholders of the Ghana International Bank, which means that their interest is critical in this entire conversation as to whether or not Ghana International Bank is going to continue staying and operating in the Regina House. That is left to be seen as this entire conversation progresses, with Trafigura already triggering processes to begin retrieving its money, or possibly also assuming ownership of that Regina House building.
And what's been the reaction of the Ghanaian community in the UK to this news?
It's been outright disappointment, and if I should say, disgust, really, because it's not been up to 3 weeks since a group of Ghanaians in the UK besieged the offices of the Ghana High Commission here in London. And essentially, what their point was to replicate what we had seen in Accra, the Occupy Jolobi House protest, was to replicate same and trumpet the same concerns, asking for proper government practices and so on and so forth. 3 weeks or so down the lane, there's more trouble, not only in Ghana this time around. The trouble is right here in London, and so you can imagine with the trouble right at their doorsteps. You can imagine the reaction that they're having. In fact, somebody mentioned to me that, look, if we are owing about 140 million US dollars to Trafigura, how difficult is that? In terms of prioritization, how do you, for instance, and this is what some of them tell me, sink as much as over 200 million US dollars into the National Cathedral project and cannot defray the 140 million US dollar judgment that owed Trafigura? They think that government must move quickly to resolve this situation, to prevent, and if you like, avert any further national embarrassment. And this is an exact quotation from what somebody told me, a national embarrassment, so to speak, Evans.
Okay, and what do we know to be the next steps as far as efforts by Trafigura to execute the judgment is concerned?
Well, Evans, persons who are close to Trafigura and really are in know of the play as much as this entire conversation between Trafigura, its subsidiary GC, and then the government of Ghana are concerned. There are already overtures being made by the government of Ghana to, as it were, secure some sort of a payment plan. And there's what I learned is that there's no finality on this particular conversation. And you'll know that the judgment itself was secured originally in January 2021. This is 2.5 years since that judgment was secured by GPGC, which is obviously the subsidiary of Trafigura. So it's stalled, and we've had a lot of, according to what I learned, there's been a lot of conversation between both sides, that's government of Ghana and then Trafigura. At this point, there are last-minute, desperate and frantic attempts by the government of Ghana to get some sort of understanding with Trafigura. Maybe a payments plan, or maybe a delay or tarrying of the demands that Trafigura is making to be able to reasonably, and if you like, in a much more dignified manner, deal with the situation. But like I'm saying, what we know is that there's no finality on these overtures that are being made by the government of Ghana just yet. And so the buildings may well be on their way out into the hands of new owners, Evans.
Okay, and thank you very much, Manuel. We'll be hearing from our own High Commissioner to the UK pretty shortly, Papa Wong-Sankuma, who, of course, has been talking about his own personal embarrassment at this latest development. And thank you, Manuel, for the reporting there from London, and at that building there, which houses the Ghana International Bank. Joining me right now is Dr. Kwabena Donkor. He's a former Power Minister, MP for Peru East constituency. He's one of those who sounded the alarm bells at the very beginning when the decision was taken by the government to terminate this particular contract. Dennis Asari is a senior research associate at IMANI Africa, also joins me with his thoughts on this. And I want to start with you, Dr. Kwabena Donkor, very briefly, opening remarks on this. As yesterday you were on when I spoke to Papa Wong-Sankuma on radio, and he was very confident that some arrangement will be found, government will find the money, but also was very honest that it's going to be very difficult to raise $140 million considering the current economic conditions. This was entirely avoidable, was it not?
Well, it was very avoidable, as I said. And let me quickly say this. In your intro, I've heard for the first time allegations of corruption.
Yes.
I am most surprised. In 7 years, this is the first time I'm hearing that allegation of corruption. Was it corruption by Trafigura, corruption by government officials? I'm most surprised.
In the court documents, the government of Ghana clarifies. In the court document, the government of Ghana clarifies in the court documents that it relates to Trafigura itself. Buying a piece of property in which they already own shares. So something around conflict of interest.
Okay, that is fine, because the intro created the impression in my mind that there was corruption on the part of government officials who signed that agreement. Once that has been clarified, I am happy. But again, in your intro, this was the cheapest of all the emergency power plants in terms of cost. First of all, there was no requirement for the government of Ghana to put down a guarantee. And then again, the total capacity charge made up of capital recovery, fixed O&M, non-fuel variable O&M came to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. It was the cheapest at the time of all the emergency power plants we brought in. And so it couldn't have been on the basis of cost. You see, every contract, at least power contract, contains conditions for termination. My worry at the time, and I raised the alarm, was that this letter signed by the then Minister of Energy, Honorable Ajako Boache, stated that Trafigura, or Ghana Power Generating Company, which was the subsidiary we have signed a contract with, had not obtained all the necessary energy commission permits. That was my worry. But in the agreement, the power purchase agreement, one of the obligations of the government of Ghana was to assist the contractor, the IPP, obtain all relevant government of Ghana permits. And so if we turn around to use that as basis for termination, it creates a problem for all of us. If we had gone by, and let me concede that the government of the day can decide to terminate any contracts. I do not dispute the right of the government of Ghana to terminate a contract, but there are consequences to termination. And in all agreements, there are conditions and processes for termination. So if you do not follow the process and conditions for termination, and particularly the termination is not justified as ruled by the arbitration panel, then we are in trouble.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what has happened.
And you're right. I mean, just to be very specific on the point you just raised there, and I have that on my screen here, because the document that we signed up to was very clear what happened if we terminate this wrongly, and including that GOG shall pay an early termination fee of an amount which is equal to the capital recovery charge and multiplied with the amount of energy the GPGC would have produced. So that all the amount that you've seen is a calculation of this, a multiplication. And if the GPGC equipment continue to operate, it says at the guarantee capacity for the remaining term, that is the early termination payment, up to a maximum of 24 months within 90 days after issuing of the termination notice by GPGC. So this was very clear, Dr. Kwanadonko, that you're stating, that the government knew this, that if you terminate this, you would pay, you'll be multiplied, and you incur this huge cost, which eventually is what happened.
Yes, but not only that. If we had negotiated the termination, we could have even taken ownership of the equipment. And at one time in the discussion, I heard there was an issue of even taking ownership of the discussion, taking ownership of the, and we bring equipment to bring it online to bear the consequences of the decision. Unfortunately, even after the court had ruled, we went to sleep. Trafigura is still doing business in Ghana, and therefore we had some leverage, at least in negotiating a payment plan. And all the way from 2021, we went to sleep. So somebody.
Oh goodness me! Let's see if we can rectify that connection to Dr. Kwanadonko. But let me bring in Dennis Asare into this conversation. And Dennis, IMANI also flagged this particular issue. Government at the time felt that they were justified, as I've explained, to terminate. But of course, Dr. Kwanadonko makes a point. After we lost that initial case, if you listen to the Attorney General's Department last few days, they can see that we lost fair and square. We renegotiated it down from the 160 plus to 140, and yet we failed to pay. Yesterday, we learned from the High Commissioner to the UK that it's purely down to the fact that we did not have the money to pay 140 million. Okay, so this is where we are. What's the assessment from IMANI as to where we go from here?
Well, good evening, Evans, and good evening to your viewers as well. If you look at what has happened with the GPGC case, we look at it from three main dimensions. One, it happens because of poor power sector planning. We are unable to plan properly over the long term, our power demand and supply. Then again, you also lead to, when you don't do that, you then have to rely on emergency power. And emergency power can be expensive. And sometimes the political risk of emergency power is that a new government comes in power and realizes that I'm unable to meet the financial obligations of maybe existing power agreement. Then they initiate process to either negotiate or terminate some agreement. And the last one we look at it is sometimes the advice that comes from the Attorney General's office. If you look at this Trafigura case, clearly the Attorney General's office ill-advised government. If you look at the 4-point basis that they cite for the reason that they want to terminate this agreement in terms of illegality for want of capacity of GPGC to enter into PPA, failure to obtain siting and construction permit, installation of use plan contrary to policy, and failure on the part of the seller to fulfill CPs and conditions subsequent. You can see clearly in the tribunal's ruling that the IPP, Trafigura or GPGC, fulfilled most of their requirement, and therefore the requirement that were not fulfilled, for example, the conditions subsequent and precedent, were dependent on the government of Ghana also performing their function. For example, in terms of siting even the plant, it was the responsibility of the government to help the IPP in terms of identifying location, citing that all of that work was not done, even when the government posed a different location in form, and that one was also not done. And even the IPP personally found even a place to do that. So you could see that at every point in time, the IPP was trying to find a way to ensure this agreement goes through, but the government had already decided from the Power Purchase Agreement Committee's report that this one must be terminated. And so they were looking for opportunities right within the agreement to get off this deal. So it's part of our poor planning as well as the ill advice from the Attorney General's office. So I see that this is cost that could have been avoided. And after the ruling was given in 2021, we had opportunities to negotiate and plan how to pay out this. And we have not been able to do that. And currently, there is no fund available in terms of mitigating some of the judgment that may arise out of termination of contract. As Dr. Kobnadonko said, the moment you decide to terminate the agreement, you must be prepared for eventualities, especially in this case, where if you look at the conclusions of the tribunal, Ghana could not provide any specific case or argument that clearly establishes a need for terminating it. And if I may get your permission to read, you could see that the tribunal even read that Ghana could not establish that GPGC was in default under terms of clause like 24, where there's a notice of breach and GPGC did not even initiate action to correct all of those things. So we are at a point where there is no money really purposely for dealing with some of these things. And this could go back into some of the costs that we are going to incur within the energy sector. So we must find money within the energy sector to pay off this. If we don't do that, what will happen is that once, if you look at the recent order by the court, now the Knowledge order has not been rejected, it's been upheld.
Yes.
And so if there is sitting on it and the court gives that order for the property now to be sold to repay the debt, the IPP has no option than to proceed in that way. So I think that immediately government must either through bilateral or diplomatic relations find a way to get to the table with the IPP to start thinking around ways that we can structure the payment. And so it's all about, the only thing that we have now is that we need to go back to the drawing board, sit with the IPP, plan a way to settle this debt, because as I see it, there's no funds available within the energy sector to deal with some of these issues.
Yeah, and both of you have raised a very important point, and it leads me to a question I will explore after this break. So if there was no real justification to terminate, what is the real reason why government felt the need to do so? Is it because they saw the deal and realized this was too costly, and so we have to find a way to terminate it? Or what was it? I mean, very curious indeed, because it's on the face of this now, for what we know from what we've heard from the Attorney General Department, and what you've said, Dennis, there wasn't the real basis for it. Is it that they just realized it was too costly and let's find a way to let it go? When we come back, we'll explore that. And then also we'll hear from Ghana's High Commissioner, the Ghana's High Commissioner to the UK, Papa Usman Ankuma, will also join us with his thoughts on where we are tonight with this particular issue and the attempts to get the deal that will avert a situation where the Ghana International Bank premises is now one that we know has been attached now, but possibly could be sold. Stay with me. If you're just joining us, we are discussing this case with Trafigura, which has landed us in hot waters, particularly in the United Kingdom. As we've just been telling you just before the break, we're live in London. We're speaking to my colleague, Manuel Cranting, who was the premises of the Ghana International Bank. That building has now been attached. We've got a confirmation of that from the Ghana High Commissioner to the UK, Papa Owusu-Ankuma himself. And that's the building in question there. If we do not find $140 million for Trafigura, that particular property belonging to the Ghana International Bank, not the entire building you see, that specific one you see, there's a building called Regina House, and it also houses a number of other institutions, including the Ghana International Bank. That particular property belonging to the Ghana International Bank is subject now of sale if we don't find the money. Yesterday, we spoke to Papa Owusu-Ankuma himself, and he confirmed that, and he told us how embarrassed he's felt since this matter went public and global.
Well, it's, as far as I'm aware, it's only Regina House, which is used for commercial purposes because it's been rented by Ghana International Bank, two other banks, and another commercial entity. That is the one that has been attached. All other properties are diplomatic properties and covered by immunity. I hear you talk about the High Commissioner's residence. I mean, that's it's being used for diplomatic purposes. Likewise, the other building you were talking about, the Chancery, it's used for diplomatic purposes. So that, as far as I'm aware, has not been attached. But I'm sure the government is taking steps to liquidate this debt. It's unfortunate that we've come to this stage. It appears our financial circumstances as a country, probably, I'm not holding brief for the finance minister, but that may have constrained the finance ministry from honoring the obligation to pay the debt by installments.
And as we speak, we know that that conversation is still ongoing with Trafigura because we simply cannot come up with 140 million right now to pay. It's a question of finding something that will work for us and work for Trafigura. If not, that building will go because that court order still is one that is in force right now. I've been speaking to Dr. Kwabena Donkor, former Power Minister, who's still with me, and Dennis Asari with the IMANI Africa. And you remember that, as always, PM Express is brought to you by Syntax Tanks. It is strong, it is tough. Alomo Bitters also experience greatness in every moment. Ghana AIDS Commission also brings you PM Express. And no matter your water needs, Syntax Tanks has it all. Syntax Tanks is first to introduce a double layer tank, and now you can have as many layers as you want. Syntax Tanks is first to introduce white inner layer tanks in Ghana. We now introduce to you the customer specs order, which lets you order any color and size of preference. Syntax Tanks gives you the longest warranty of 7 years, which no other tank gives you in Ghana. So whatever your water consumption, size of project, or demand, choose Syntax Tanks. We have agents nationwide. Call us on 0244-335-168 or shop online at syntaxgh.com. Syntax Tanks, a stronger your tap. Dr. Kwabena Donkor, let me ask you, you've been very clear that as far as the power purchase agreement that we signed with Trafigura is concerned, it was the cheapest. And yet, government still felt the need to...
Yes,
Yeah.
Let me even give you a few more. For example, it was also the shortest because it was for 4 years. The duration was 4 years. It was the shortest of all the emergency power purchase agreements we signed to hold us over a short term whilst the normal IPPs kick in. So it was over 4 years. Yes, it was used equipment, and it was known at that time. And it was not the only used equipment that was brought in. The AXA plant was also used. It wasn't new. And so for AXA, we signed a 5-year agreement. And the government has found it necessary to extend this agreement for another 10 years. So the question of it, the equipment being used, is neither here nor there. It was known at the time, the duration was 4 years. Let me also talk. If the government has so wanted, they could have started when it came online. They did the same for Amandi. They did the same for Jacobson. So again, there were options to stagger to meet what we thought, they thought we had excess capacity. We could have staggered. Okay, come online in year 3 instead of year 1. That was not also done. And then the reason given in the letter of termination wouldn't have been the reason. Probably there are some other reasons that we don't know. But in terms of the official reasons given in the letter of termination, it wasn't tenable. And we advised at that time, not just myself, other people, including IMANI and others, advised. You see, there is also the importance of process in governance. Yes, you might have all the power and think you can do whatever you want, but there is the process. And we didn't also go by the process. So it is not true that they brought in used equipment. We knew it when we were signing. And so it had the shortest duration of 4 years. It had the cheapest tariff of the time. And could have been staggered, assuming without admitting that they thought we didn't need it to kick in year 1. They could have been asked to come on 2-3 years down the line. I just thought I should clarify that.
Yeah, and it's an important clarification. And Dennis, to that point I was raising earlier, so if indeed it's the case, as we've heard from the former Prime Minister, that it was the cheapest, can we even guess the real reasons why government then decides to go ahead and terminate? We've seen the reasons. All of you have questioned the reasons that the government had adduced. The illegality, for want of capacity of GNPC to enter the PPA agreement, failure to obtain a site and construction permit, installation of used plant contrary to policy, failure on the part of GPGC to fulfill its CPs and conditions subsequent. Then, as you said, all these excuses were simply not good enough. But government still went ahead. And again, I was suggesting that possibly they realized it was expensive. But Dr. Kwame says it was not expensive, it was the cheapest. So any other reasons why we will get ourselves into this current mess, if all the reasons were not tenable?
Well, Evan, so if you look at the work of the Power Purchase Agreement Committee that was established, their objective was to identify how we could reduce the excess capacity cost that government would have to pay because of the emergency plants that we had procured.
So it was about cost. It was
mainly about cost, because if you look at the arguments that they made in the Power Purchase Agreement Committee's report, specifically for the GPGC project, the main argument they raised was that if they allow the plants to operate, annually we will have to pay excess capacity of about $25 million. And over the lifetime of the plant, we would have to now pay about $115 or $116 million. So government's argument was that primarily was on cost. Secondly, they also argued that the plant was going to be situated in Pong, that is Tema, and at that time, the reverse flow that would allow natural gas to be transported from the west to the east had not been completed. And so the government argued that the plant would be placed or situated at a place where natural gas is rarely available, or you don't have natural gas in large quantities. And so the argument was that because the main fuel the plant would use is not highly available in Tema, and that it will cost more, it was good for government to terminate that agreement. But if you juxtapose that to the argument they make at the tribunal, really did the Attorney General or the representative of Ghana raise issues around cost. One of the issues that they raised was that the conditions precedent and the conditions subsequent were not even met. They also even argued that even the EPA itself was not effective. And so their main argument technically was cost. But when they appeared before the tribunal, the legal arguments that they make was that in terms of even the whole validity of the EPA itself and other things that needed to be done for that EPA to be valid, for government to be compelled to hold that EPA, all those conditions were not met. And you see in the ruling that Ghana could not provide substantive reasons or credible reasons to show that the IPP could not meet that. So primary reason was cost. And the government at the time even estimated that the excess capacity cost was estimated around $500 million every year. And so most of the analysis they made, GPGC power plant was one of the victims that had to be terminated. And so it was purely cost and natural gas availability issues. But if you look at the ruling at the tribunal, no cost argument was made. That is why if you look at the concluding arguments by GPGC, they raised the issue that Ghana terminated the agreement merely on cost-benefit analysis. They realized that if they terminate this agreement, it will inure to the benefit of the state and had no argument or no reason relating to the technical issues like conditions precedents, conditions subsequent. It was purely because of cost. And we did not really look at what we must do to ensure that we don't incur any cost. If you look at the agreement,
I must ask you, if it was primarily about cost, do you find that to be a justifiable reason for the government to look into this and decide to go ahead and terminate? Was there a basis that at the time to relook at this matter closely based on the cost?
Well, so government was really keen. We have to look at it in the entirety of emergency plans that were procured. And so government was seeking to minimize the cost that they will incur and the debt that may come into the energy sector. But if you look at the information provided by Dr. Kobna Donko, who was really part of this whole process, he mentioned that if you look at 4 cents per kilowatt, and the duration was very short. And so given the cost and the duration of that, we could have looked at other long-term ones that we are allowed to stay comparatively and said, okay, maybe the start date, we could push it forward. So there were other opportunities at the time for us to address the cost implication, because if you push the operational date forward, then you also mitigate the cost that you may have to incur by the start date of 2018. So the cost argument comparatively, you realize that if you compare it to other emergency plans, then you say that, and then the duration, then it's very hard to believe that it was only on cost. For me, I believe that the committee had already decided that this power plant must go, and that is why they find it.
And it's curious because I read through the court's judgment and the defense that we put up in court. I struggle to see the cost argument pushed quite forcefully by our lawyers in court, if that was the basis.
It was never made. If you look at the argument that we raised, there was no point where the government raised that given the cost and comparing it to existing emergency plant, this GPGC plant was expensive. We didn't raise all of those arguments. And even the conditions that we said the IPP had not satisfied, we failed to even find a site for the IPP. Even with the gas testing, Ghana delayed. And if you look at arguments that the government made that they presented an old plant, we were aware and we agreed, and it was after that government was aware of the state of the plant that Parliament ratified the agreement. And so all the arguments that we make throughout the entire process, there was never a time where we cite costs. That is why the tribunal found it worthy that the main reason why the government terminated this deal was purely because if they terminate it, it reduces the cost that the energy sector would have to bear. And so it was purely cost-benefit analysis and not really the fact that technically the IPP did not hold its aspect of the bargain. And that is why you can't find any argument of cost in the legal argument presented at the tribunal. Yeah. Because that was not the reason.
I mean, Dr. Kabal Donko, you, thankfully, are a member of Parliament, and Parliament will resume pretty shortly. We now have $140 million that we need to pay. We paid part of it, from what I understand. We don't know exactly how much. What should happen now? Should somebody be held responsible? And for what exactly?
You see, I take the position that in public office, you are not likely to get 100% of your decisions all turning out to be right because of the nature of the operating environment.
Oh, we lost him there. Let me put that same question to Dennis. Hopefully we can re-establish.
The process has to be followed. In any case, at 3.7 cents capital recovery over 4 years and with a guaranteed 92%, it will be nowhere near this amount in any case. So you see, I believe there is a reason for termination that you and I don't know. Because for a sensible decision-making process, it doesn't add up. So there must be some other reason that we don't know. Having said that, I believe the Ghanaian state should ask the people who took the decision to terminate to tell us why they terminated. I believe that is the route to use if we have to improve on our governance.
Okay.
Those who were responsible will have to tell us why they took that decision. Because commercially, legally, it doesn't make sense. And even from an energy perspective, you don't terminate the cheapest emergency plant you have. And then if you say it was an old plant, we knew it. AXA was also an old plant. And yet we've gone ahead. I mean, we signed for 5 years as an emergency plan. This government has gone ahead to extend it for a further 10 years. So if you add all this, we find it extremely difficult to justify. Maybe Honorable Ajako Wache, who signed a letter, may be able to tell us what some of us don't know. But it is also so important. My colleague made a critical mention, the lack of planning. The Energy Commission, by its enabling act, is expected to plan medium and long term for Ghana. We don't do that. Today, as we sit, if we don't get some new generating assets online, the next 2-3 years we'll have a serious issue with generating capacity. And then we go into another emergency and we'll be firefighting. So as a nation, we should also take that extremely seriously.
And I just want to circle back to the accountability question. If it must be done, who must lead it? Parliament?
I believe Parliament is the best institution to do that because the decision to terminate was taken by the executive arm. And therefore, you cannot ask the executive arm to investigate why it terminated. It ought to be Parliament. And Parliament under pressure from civil society. Parliament under pressure from civil society. Ghanaians must know why. We have a right to know. And so I would and civil society to ask for this accountability. And what will be the lessons learned? They need to respect processes. You see, when you consider the fact that Trafigura has serious business in Ghana, I believe if we had gone through a process, it would have been easier to compromise and to stagger. Okay, bring the plant online in 4 or 5 years. It could have been possible. Yeah. But we didn't do that. And even after we had conceded at arbitration and signed on to pay by installments, we defaulted, going back to Trafigura or the arbitration panel to even ask for more grace to do that.
I see. Dennis, do you support the call for accountability through Parliament?
Yes, Evans, I agree entirely with Dr. Kobna Donkoda. At least some questions need to be asked and someone must provide responses, given that if you look at the arguments we made to the tribunal, has nothing to do with the Attorney General's recommendations to Cabinet as well as to the Executive to terminate this agreement. And for me, what is even more important is that I think it's about time that we pay attention to some of the advice that Attorney General's department gives to certain key sectors of our economy, like energy, where you require that is highly technical, and you need people who understand the space well to give the appropriate advice. In most cases, you see contracts happen, the Attorney General gives advice, but that advice is rarely published. And I think it's about time we bring some transparency and openness in some of the advice given by state agencies on specific government agreements. Then, if you look at the power, Dr. Donko also mentioned, even following the process, one of the important aspects of the process is transparency and openness in discussing some of these agreements when they start. In most cases, this agreement travel very far to the end when, after Parliament has ratified it, that is when some of the details start coming out. And if we want to bring transparency and more accountability into the space, I believe that right from the process of negotiating contracts and even discussions about getting a very high valuable energy project like a plant, there should be conversations within the civil society space as well as in Parliament. There should be regular debates or consistent debates on some of these issues. So we weigh the pros and cons. If we have done all of these things, I'm not sure we'll be at this point. So I believe that some questions need to be asked, and we must find some answers, especially publication of the Power Purchase Agreement Committee's report on each of the emergency power plants.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dennis. Dennis Osari is the Senior Research Associate at IMANI, and you had also the Dr. Kwabena Donkor, who is a former Power Minister on the subject. This is a subject that we'll keep a close eye on because we still need to get clarity on what we're going to do with the $140 million judgment debt. Because as we've shown you tonight, live from London, that property has now formally been attached. That's the Ghana International Bank's property has now been attached. And unless we find a deal, we reach some sort of compromise with Trafigura, it's going to be sold. And we'll see if we can get some clarity for you in the coming days. Enjoy the rest of your evening.